Well, my name is Angela McIntyre. I'm an academic, I suppose, at the moment. In my fairly recent past, I was an international development worker working for UN agencies and nonprofit organizations on the other side of the world. I am of Indigenous and European ancestry, and that's one of the reasons that I came home to Canada, was to try and start looking at some of the food system and food security issues a little bit closer to home. And so that brought me to Salt Spring Island, a place where you don't have to dig your car out from under the snow. Mm-hmm. But also where I was definitely drawn here by the food culture and the cultural diversity, and the fact that it's an island community and has some very interesting political and social dynamics going on. And there's so much good stuff to eat here too.
And could you tell us a little bit about your doctoral research? I need to be looking at me.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So my research, I was seconded to a project run by the University of Pretoria in South Africa. It was funded by the Water Research Commission of South Africa, and it was looking at the basically the nutrition outcomes among poor rural people living in what were the former homelands of South Africa, so their native reserves, and trying to understand what were the impacts of having access to irrigation on nutrition. So looking at how it impacts dietary diversity, what kinds of crops people were growing, and generally measuring things like childhood stunting, which is an indication of the micronutrient quality of diets. Looking at overweight and obesity, which is kind of a new thing that's connected to nutrition transition in South Africa, and urbanization and the shift of food systems towards producing more processed industrial type of food, which is what we have here. And so what we found in South Africa in these four communities who are statistically the lowest income or the poorest communities is that with this nutrition transition and this shift, this industrialization of the food system, we're finding people living within the same households who are suffering from both over and undernutrition. So you have people who are obese, measured by body mass indices, and at risk of chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension. And the children in the households are stunted from basically the poor quality of their diet, so lack of micronutrients, vitamins, and so on. So you have this simultaneously occurring problem of over and under nutrition in the same places, and this is all connected to how the industrial food system is sort of making our food more uniform. It's cheaper. The food system has gotten really good at making calories, producing calories, and distributing them to places where previously, people didn't have access. People didn't even have cash incomes or access to shops and supermarkets. Now, there's this phenomenon of supermarketization and the takeover of big corporations of supply chains that reached even into the farthest corners and the poorest parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's not just South Africa where we're seeing this. South Africa is comparatively industrialized compared to other countries in the region, but we're seeing it in other countries as well, the industrialization of food systems. And it's creating these very rapid nutrition transitions that are impacting people not just nutritionally, but they're undermining food systems in a way that has some fairly serious cultural and economic and ecological impacts as well.
Have you seen any, just on the whole area of the global food system, are you seeing either in Canada or in sub-Saharan Africa much local movement into kind of develop an alternative system or to take back the food system into people's hands?
There definitely is. There's been a lot of consciousness raising over the last couple of decades. I think that the food sovereignty movement, for example, it's globally articulated, so where there's been a lot of very strong activism in Central and South America, it's starting to move now into sub-Saharan Africa and into South Africa as well. I think that local food movements are gaining strength. They're connecting with each other. They're talking to each other. The problem is that they don't get very much support from governments. Governments tend to look at food security and nutrition problems from the top down, and what they see are these broad patterns of deficits and deprivation. And so the solutions are usually of the same kind. They come up with these template solutions, in South Africa, for example, the most recent food policy instruments talk about agriculture as an engine of economic growth. And they have this very, very neoliberal economic model in mind that envisions, the poorest, least nourished and probably least capable in terms of entrepreneurial skills South Africans as business people. We're all going to climb on board and we're going to boost our economy. We're going to grow the GDP, with small-scale agriculture. And it in theory, from the top down, it looks to be possible when you look at it in terms of land and natural assets. But when you actually go to some of the places where local food systems have really been decimated by, for example, the infiltration of supermarkets, you find that people have a very different set of assets and capabilities than what is imagined by the government. And so solutions to food security and malnutrition need to be found. They need to be co-created with communities, and they need to take advantage of the natural and human assets and capabilities. And this isn't really being done, and I think that that's where local food movements are really important, because we define our own problems. We know what we have to work with. And we have the kinds of relationships already in place. I think this is also a big obstacle. To imagine that every community is capable of getting together and coming up with solutions to deal with their own food security, it's problematic. We see often in communities, especially recovering from conflict, communities that have been decimated by genocidal policies like residential school, land expropriation, invasive and extractive natural resource theft. You find there's a lot of trauma and a lot of harm done to these communities in a psychosocial way. And so there's a lot of healing that needs to take place before communities can actually work together and start looking at their own solutions in feasible ways. But it's not just the emotional healing, it's the economic reality as well. We are sitting right now on unceded territory of Coast Salish people. It's stolen land. Stolen land has, for many generations now in Canada, subsidized our farming industry. And I think that the farming community here and across Canada has definitely some work to do in terms of responding to the Truth and Reconciliation call to action.
Just to follow up on the idea of the issue, not the idea of the issue of stolen land. And I was reading a piece yesterday about, there's 1.5% of land in the States is owned by quote-unquote ethnic minorities. There's been this massive land grab from Black Americans in the South, who used to own 10% of the land and now own pretty much nothing. What do you think is what's the longer term solution around reconciliation between the settlers and Indigenous peoples?
Don't answer yet. Sorry. Okay.
I hesitate even to speculate on that because, we're dealing with many, many different nations with many different priorities, many different sort of levels of socioeconomic development, if you will. And I think that, if we're really to honor the idea of self-determination, I'm not in a position really to answer that question, because communities need to be able to make their own decisions. And in order to do that, they have to have the resources with which to make them. And I think under the current regime, where Indigenous people have, I think it's around 0.2% of the land, you know, it's really difficult. I mean, people just don't have the assets and capabilities to be able to realize this idea of self-determination. And it's, you know, and unless we do, unless we get this land back, unless we, you know, can assert our sovereignty over these territories again, it really is, reconciliation will continue to be a bit of a ruse, I think. It's kind of a joke. I mean, the commitment that the Canadian government made to UNDRIP and to responding to the calls to action was really, it was quite fantastical. I mean, some of the commitments that were made were not even, you know, under the jurisdiction of the Canadian government. You know, the papal apology, for example. You know, Justin Trudeau is not going to get the Pope to apologize to Indigenous people in Canada. So, yeah, I think it's incredibly complex, and I think that, you know, people tend to think of Indigenous people as kind of a uniform category. And to have uniform characteristics that are probably, you know, generally negative. I think that there's a lot of cultural racism around how we think about Indigenous people, and you know, those are some obstacles that, you know, the settler community, that non-Indigenous people need to work with as well. I'm going to digress in a minute. Ask me another question.
Just sort of a follow-up in relation to, you said you articulated very well the connection between the violence against the environment and the violence against people. If you could expand a little bit on that. And then if we could go into the ways in which you think that we could be learning and building on Indigenous knowledge, both past and present, in terms of thinking about our food here on Salisbury.
I think the potential in regenerative food systems is for us to confront the violence that's so built into our food systems. And it's the violence of colonization. I mean, the global food regime has been built on colonization. The early explorers and settlers were you know, driven by this sort of insatiable need to appropriate resources. You know, fish, forests, you know, mines and energy sort of came a little bit later. But, you know, and it's all around us. It's in factory farming. It's in the way we treat non-living creatures. Yes, something has to die so we can eat. Something gets hurt so we can eat. Plants, animals, but we shouldn't be hurting each other when we eat in order to get our food. And so I think that this focus on local food systems makes us actually accountable for the violence. It makes us accountable for the lives that we take in order to feed ourselves. And we can't deny it. I mean, I don't think very many people who eat a hamburger would be able to sit and watch, you know, the apocalypse of blood and shit that unfolds at an enormous, you know, factory scale abattoir. It's terrifying. And I think that violence and many other forms of violence, the violence against Indigenous people, sort of, it hangs with us. It makes us sick. It's making our environment sick. And it contaminates our relationships with each other and our relationships with the land and with nature. And so in order to heal that, we first need to be able to confront it. And it's really hard to confront when your food is coming from really far away. So if your food is coming from close by, you can see how the animals die. You can see, you know, the harvest. You can see the pain. You can see the backaches and the sore knees of the farmers who are planting. You know, the young people who come from all over Canada to participate in this amazing local food system we have, who sleep in tents, who work for nothing except the privilege of having a bowl of, you know, carrots and fresh salad at the end of the day to eat. I think that having a vibrant local food system like this really it really brings us very close to not just the pain and suffering and sacrifice that goes into, but also the joy and the abundance. And I mean, this is a really beautiful place, and it's beautiful partly because of the natural environment, the untouched environment, but also because of the man-made environment. You know, what we've cultivated and changed. And I suppose that's where the question of Indigenous land and food systems comes in. So this land was settled with particular understandings of the value of land and the potential of land. Do you want me to start that over?
Sure.
If you want.
Can I? Okay, now I have to articulate that thought better because it's really important. I want to talk about the value of land somehow. Ask me another question.
Well, this are we thinking about the economic value of land as opposed to the cultural value of land, or the social and emotional value of land? Is that the difference you're trying to bring out here?
I think there is no difference. I don't think there is a difference between the cultural, the social, emotional, and economic value of land. I think that we have different value propositions where this is concerned. And I think that if we're going to stop committing ecocide against our planet, we need to start re-examining some of those value propositions and trying to heal some of the violence that has occurred between consumers and industrial societies and the land. I think that food systems, so Indigenous food systems are holistic in that food is sort of a meeting place of social, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being. And you can't really extract one of those and still have the others. They're mutually dependent. They're mutually exclusive. So if you ignore the social relationships in your economy, you're going to create some kind of imbalance. You're going to hurt people. It's going to be unequal. If you ignore the spiritual heritage, if you ignore what our ancestors and our elders have to teach us about the land in the past, then that's going to create another kind of imbalance. We're always going to be ambitious and vain and hubristic in how we produce our food and how we exploit things. We're going to become very short-sighted, I think. I think if we ignore, the physical side is the obvious. I think most people, to most people, the physical damage that's been done to the land is pretty obvious. We've all seen aerial photographs of the tar sands and of clear cuts and so on. Those things are pretty obvious. But I think what's really subtle is the way those things all hang together and how they're mutually exclusive.
Good. Those are probably my questions. Any other thoughts or anything else you'd like to say?
So your time in South Africa and your time now here in Canada, are there things you see that are similarities or less from both places, or is there anything you see that...
I see some definite similarities between Canada and South Africa. South Africa is quite far ahead of us in terms of reconciliation, and there are obviously a number of reasons for this. The majority took power in South Africa after the first democratic elections, and so reconciliation was a national agenda, and it was all about creating public discourses, that people would hear and talk about around reconciliation and the injustices of the past. And I think that here we're still very much in denial about reconciliation, and it's been kind of a covert process, and it's easy to ignore. So in that sense, I think South Africa is quite a ways ahead of us. We still need, I think many Canadians still need the gut punch of what was done to Indigenous people in Canada. We still need to viscerally feel the pain, not just of residential school in the 60s scoop and the nutrition experiments done on children in residential school, the horror of Indian hospitals, but the gut punch of what's happened to the land, the extinction of bison, which is it's like the extinction of herring here in Coast Salish territory. I mean, herring. The southern part of Vancouver Island is Lekwungen territory, which means the land of smoked herring. If you want to get a smoked herring on Salt Spring Island, you go to the supermarket, and it probably comes from, I don't know where, from Iceland or someplace. The waters around here used to be teeming with herring, and they feed salmon, which feed orcas. So when we hear about the declining population of orcas in this region, in these waters, we need to also think about what we've fished practically into extinction, which is the herring, and ask questions like, well, why isn't there a ban on herring fisheries until they're allowed to recover to the point where that ecosystem is back in balance? There are a lot of elephants in the room. There are a lot of unanswered questions and issues that are put aside, and I think that this also has to do with fragility. There's a lot of fragility, and I think that's related to violence as well. So when you're sitting in a castle that's built on a foundation of violence, it's very fragile. And I think that we see this every day. We hear this in the news every day. Fuel prices are going up because of a pipeline protest, And I always have to ask myself, if your economy is so fragile that a handful of Indigenous people with placards are creating this kind of economic instability, if you feel like your jobs are threatened, and these are the discourses. These are the discourses we hear. We hear all the time. There's this sort of it's implicit that Indigenous people causing trouble, claiming land and stopping pipelines is somehow going to cost us jobs and destabilize our economy. Well, we have an awfully fragile economy if that's the case. And I think that fragility is something that's used to manipulate people. It's used to manipulate working class people, good, honest working class people who are dependent on these industries, on these extractive industries. And I think they deserve better. They deserve a more sustainable future instead of this foolish, short-sighted, extractive economy that we have, which essentially makes us a second world country. If we consider the fragility of our economy and the state of Indigenous people, we're sliding a little bit in global esteem, I think.